Good. We have three amazing people today. So first of all, you guys can remember Bruno. Bruno is one of our favorite attorneys, and we know that Bruno specializes in dispute resolutions, commercial and property law, anything relating to strategy, funding, planning, you name it. Bruno is the attorney that you need to go to. You don't make a decision when it comes to investments if you don't speak to Bruno. Then secondly, who we have is Lisa Hiku or Hugo. I'm not sure if it's Hiku or Hugo. So Lisa is a tax and legal advisor. Now, if you think about Lisa's probably one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to structuring and legal advice for your property. So we are very lucky to have her as well. And then lastly, we have Nico Du Plooy. So who's Nico? Nico is probably the best numbers guy in South Africa. I've seen his spreadsheets, and his spreadsheets can make your head spin. So Nico is an investor himself. He sources properties for investors. He helps investors make decisions on whether this property is a good investment. So he's an investor, a coach, and the best numbers guy in South Africa. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. We are really looking forward to just getting this wealth of information from you guys. And it looks like everybody is really excited to see you guys. So just as a last reminder for all the guys online, please remember to add your name, your surname, and the office that you're from in the chat box just for record purposes. And that is it from me. Let's get started. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicolene. It's always such a pleasure to be with you guys, and thanks for the lovely introduction. I think I think that flatters all of us quite a bit. Yeah, so welcome to everyone. It's quite a cold day, so I'm freezing here in Joburg. I hope everyone's good. Hope everyone's warm and excited to be here. So we've got a jam-packed session. Yeah, while preparing these slides, I landed up realizing how much content there really is, and the fact that we just don't have time to cover all of it. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this, if you guys want more information, please reach out. Just let us know. At the end, we'll have a little comment section there where we can get your feedback so we can improve this moving forward. And yeah, maybe we can get together again, do a part 2, do a part 3. We'll arrange depending on whether you guys enjoy it or not. So I'm going to get started. So today's talk or discussion revolves around the investor. So it's about thinking and speaking like an investor, and just kind of getting the mindset right so that you as agents and property practitioners understand where the investors are coming from and are better suited to cater for their needs. And that's going to be our primary focus for today. This is, just some of the companies that I've worked with recently in the exact same property space, in the education space, in the skills and training space. And yeah, just to maybe start off, I don't want to waste any time. I've only got 7 minutes left before I need to start with part 2. So this is the outline of the topics for today, basically the agenda of what we're going to be speaking about. You see, I divided it into about 6 parts. Speaking like an investor is where Nico is going to come in. He's basically going to speak to you wearing his investor hat, wearing his specialist hat, wearing his sourcing hat, and he's going to give you insights into what the investors normally look out for when they approach him for properties. Legal solutions is where I'm going to jump in. So this is about creativity. It's about taking what the law allows and doing something with it and packaging it so that the investors get the best result out of it. So I'm going to go through a couple of different options, things you can look at, things you can consider. The importance of this obviously is when an investor comes to you and they've got these ideas, at least you guys are equipped to be able to deal with these, and you know how to answer them, you know whether it's possible or not possible, and you've got the tools, at least the red flags, to be able to notice if something isn't above board, or if something isn't going to work, or it's unlawful, or it's illegal, or whatever the case is. Investor management, quick topic. I've discussed it before the last time I was with you guys, just regarding actually, managing tenants, managing the landlords. From an investor perspective, I'm going to keep it short because I did discuss it to quite a degree the last time. Again, if you guys did want more information, we can always make a plan to do a part 2. And then Lisa's going to come in and she's going to speak about investment structures. The reason why it's important for you as estate agents to understand this, number one, is the fact that you want to be able to prime your property investors, your clients, your purchasers, to be able to buy more and more properties, and they are going to see this as a value add. So on an introductory note, so it seems quite intuitive, but we do need to ask ourselves, who buys property, right? And this is where the mindset comes in. So you're going to have, the natural answer to this is yes, we've got the first-time home buyers. These are the owner-occupiers. They want to buy a property, they want to live in it, and that's pretty much it. And then you've got the property investors that come in and buy the properties. That's your second batch, right? Now, what we're trying to do here today is we're trying to basically change that paradigm. It's not actually the case that you have two distinct classes of property buyers. It's property buyers as a whole. It just so happens that the guys buying their first home just happen to be buying their first property. That does not exclude them from being property investors in the future. And we need to think like that, because the problem is, and you'll see that Lisa will speak about this later on, from a structuring perspective, it's sometimes a very big mistake to just let your first-time buyer buy something and not think about how they're going to buy their second, their third, their fourth property. And that's the kind of value add that we want to give to you guys now, so that you can have these conversations with them. Your clients get value out of this, and they actually become loyal to you, and they want to keep coming back to you in order to buy more and more properties. So without any further ado, I think let's maybe bring Nico in to start having a discussion from an introductory perspective. What is a property investor? What do they sound like? What do they look for? How they expect to be dealt with to a certain degree? What properties do they want to invest in? So we can at least wrap our heads around that before we move forward and start going into detail about what solutions exist, what the structures they typically use, and that sort of thing. So Nico, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you, Nicoline, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm excited today to be on the other side of the information section, because normally I would be spending a lot of time, training investors and speaking on the sourcing side of identifying property investment opportunities. And yeah, I think, from my point of view, as it's stated there, I am a property investor, I'm a broker, I'm also a coach and an entrepreneur and a business owner. And yeah, I really enjoy what I'm doing. And like Nicoline also indicated, I'm someone who really loves the numbers. And you will also see when I go through some of the slides today, it is really number orientated. And, thinking from an investor perspective, that is exactly what you need to do as an investor, to identify if it is a good investment opportunity. And, if the numbers don't show it, you're not going to invest it. And I think that is one of the main things that's normally comes out from an investor perspective. We operate with a calculator, not with our hearts. I think everyone should agree, except for the first-time buyers. They would love to buy a property that looks nice and feels nice, and everything just fits. But for a property investor, we're actually willing to look at the property that's a little bit stinky and smelly and dirty and doesn't look like the first-time home buyer's property. But we can see the potential in the property and would be able to take that into an investment opportunity. So yeah, I'm going to jump straight into it and maybe just go through a couple of slides that will give you some information of how does an investor's mindset work when they actually operate and look for a property investment opportunity. So yeah, first of all, I would like to tell you that investors are not easy to work with, and it is meant as a joke, but I think it really rings true. So at the end of the day, they do require a lot of information. So let's look at some of the investor requirements in this process. So before considering an opportunity, the investor will conduct desktop research, and I think this is where they will spend most of their time before actually even looking at going to view a property. So the next couple of slides is the things that they will think about before they will actually confirm a viewing. To us, that would need, a viewing definitely needs to happen, but you will see what we go through first. So during desktop research, we will look at market values for similar types of properties. And yes, most of the investors out there will have access to their Lightstones. So they will first of all look at the comparing listed values. So that would be your property 24s, private properties, anything that's listed in the area. For similar types of properties, they will go through the photos to identify the property that they are looking at is similar than the one that they are investigating, and trying to find a listed value for similar apple for apple comparison type of properties. And then they will also go on to a Lightstone report and actually try and do exactly the same. They will look at the earth sizes, they will look at the under roof sizes, they will look at the bedrooms, they will look at the bathrooms, and even the garages will be taken into consideration in order to identify from a sales perspective, you know, how much, what is the market value for a like-for-like comparison type of property. Rental income, same thing, listed rental values that once again, they will go to places like your property 24, private property, pocket let, all of those, in order to identify what is the competition in the market for rental incomes for a specific type of property. They will compare TPN, you know, and they will also communicate with the listing agents that is doing letting in the areas. You know, either they will have someone in their power team, or they will look out for letting advertisement boards, contact these estate agents and ask them for a little bit of information based on, you know, 1 bed, 2 bed, 3 bed, depending on the strategy that they will implement on a property. Estimated renovation costs. So this is for a beginning, you know, just an estimation in order to identify, you know, what would be the budget for them in order to determine an offer price. So they will obviously need to confirm this in an in-person viewing, and also part of the due diligence at the end, that would probably be in an OTP as well. And we will talk about that a little bit later. And this is all dependent on the strategy, and most definitely also dependent on the experience of the investor who will be looking at the opportunity. So we would obviously also like to identify different strategies for an opportunity. What can the property provide? Is location and everything is playing a big role in this decision, but also the numbers is the most important. But they would like to find two strategies. Number one would be the main strategy for them to identify, and this is the strategy that they will pursue most likely, but they also like to see if there's an exit strategy. So to just use an example, if you are calculating on a flip to buy, renovate and sell the property as an example, you would want to know that if the flip is not selling in time and you need to take longer, your holding cost is going to be much longer. How can I mitigate that risk? And obviously would then be to put a tenant in the property to cover the expenses, and therefore a buy to let might be an exit strategy just to cover the expenses for the duration of the time frame and the holding period that is now longer. And that would therefore be an exit strategy from a buy to let perspective in that scenario. So consider the types of funding for the project. So would they be buying, you know, through a bond? Would they buy cash? Would they use angel investors? Would they use joint venture partners? This also gets considered and taken into consideration fairly easy and early in the project. Next of all is considering the purchasing structure. Will it be in the personal name? Will it be in a company? Will it be in a trust? Is also considered. And then from a management, maintenance and vacancies perspective is also taken into consideration in the cash flow projections. And then the holding costs and timeframes is then also taken into consideration. Now, I've made a note at the bottom of the screen to just say this is extremely difficult if a property address is not provided. And we've actually, you know, internally between the estate, the investors, there's quite a lot of talk about the fact that, you know, we struggle to get the physical address from estate agents, which can be challenging. Because in order for us to do all of this homework and market values, and especially if we're living in an area to identify where that property is, and we can't get the address, you know, it's not going to give us the specific information we require in order to make, you know, decisions on a property investment that we need to look at. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that in the end a lot, about who wants to provide this and who don't want to, but we'll get there. Second of all, the investor will request information about the property. In order for us to understand the expenses of the property, we need to know what it is. So that would be your water and electricity. And, it is interesting for people to say, yeah, but, it's depending on the usage. But it's also good to understand what the electricity bills and water bills look like in order to determine the holding cost until you've placed tenants in a property. So we would also want to know what is the rates and taxes values, what is the levies, if there's any special levies and if there's any special levies planned, and any other specific property-specific type of expenses in a property would be very important. So the municipal statement is very important for us to have the breakdown. What is the sewage, what is the bin removal prices and so forth, because that really is important for your holding cost calculations. Then we will request some documentation, and this is all dependent on the strategy that would, is being considered as a main or an exit strategy. So it's not personal, so the investor will not take your word for it. They would like to see supporting documentation for it. So once again, the municipal statement, as I just described and explained. They would also, if there's tenants in the property with lease agreements, they would like to have copies of the lease agreements as well as the rent roll, in order to see if the actual tenant is paying on time and, are they paying every month? Are they arrear? Is all information that is very important to consider as an investor. And I think it's not unreasonable from an investor perspective to request this type of information, because if you have to honor the lease agreement over the sale, you would want to know, obviously, what is the type of person you're dealing with, what is the date the lease agreement would expire. All of that information then becomes very important on a lease agreement. Body corporate financials, statements, and the body corporate rules is very important for us to also see, if the building is being looked after. Is there a lot of people that's not paying their levies on time, resulting in the repairs and maintenance of the building not being able to be kept up to date? And also, what is the rules within it with regards to how many people are allowed within a normal flatlet, as an example, which is all very important information for an investor when he's identifying his strategy. When it comes to certain property projects, like converting a property to a multi-let, maybe even considering building, like a development project, building plans is extremely important, and it's also the seller's responsibility to have it up to date. This is probably one of the most troublesome type of questions to ask an agent, is with regards to building plans. Does the seller have building plans? Because most of the time the seller don't even know, have never seen the building plans, but it needs to be obtained. And if it's possible to obtain the building plans fairly early in a project, from a seller, I think it will really help, from an investor perspective, to be able to move forward with this fairly quickly. Title deed. So unfortunately, a lot of information is not listed on, the building plans, or it's not listed on the report on Lightstone. And therefore, the title deed would become the only document an investor or a developer can work from in order to determine where is, the water piping underneath, where is the roads that it's planned, and everything that is on the property, what you are allowed to do. Are you allowed to open a commercial property on this? Are you able to change it? How far from the street? All of that has become extremely important for us on the title deed. And therefore, that sometimes is an important document to obtain. And also then confirmation of zoning certificate. If you say it's business one, then we would like to get the business one zoning certificate in order to plan according to that strategy and move forward as well. Right, the investor will then also investigate, like I've indicated, the rental income in depth with regards to, how much income can I operate or generate from a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom. If I have a 3-bedroom house with a garage with staff quarters at the back, can the garage be converted into a 1 or a 2-bedroom unit? Is there also a flatlet on there? What is the incomes that I can generate from a normal 3-bedroom house, from a flatlet? Is it a bachelor? Is it a 1-bedroom? Or is it just room rentals, depending on the area and what is allowed in that specific area? So it's very important to obtain that information in order to determine the rental income and the value that you can generate from this property. The investor will then also check this, like I've stated, against the TPN reports, the competition in the market, and also the letting agents, as I explained earlier. Right. The investor will then take into consideration his numbers that is calculated based on everything that we've covered. So at this moment, we've basically got estimation as well, not so much estimation. In some instances, like your renovations, you will have estimations, but you will have a fairly good idea about what is your market values, what is your rental incomes, and what is the strategy that you would like to employ, what is going to be an estimated purchase price, which will also then help you with your holding costs. And then you would consider, is this something I'm looking for? Is it something I'm interested in? And therefore, I will either reject this opportunity or I will schedule a viewing. And this would possibly be with a power team as well. So after viewing the property, the investor will then secure the opportunity through an OTP. So he would have now done a complete check. It looks like the figures that he's put together can work. He would determine an offer price that will work for the deal. And then he would obviously, like I put here, secure an opportunity through an OTP at the right price by considering the purchase entity, whether he's buying it in personal name, existing company, or a company to be formed, or a trust. And it is also important for investors to sometimes make sure that they set the expectations correctly with you as agents in order to understand what will be taking place in this process of purchasing a property. It has happened in the past that they would have placed company to be formed, represented by that specific agent, but it could happen that they actually find a joint venture partner that have an existing company, and then OTP might need to be re-signed and cancelled because of the fact that they would continue with the deal on the same numbers, just that they need to change the purchasing entity for such an opportunity. From a finance perspective, would they be putting down a deposit to reduce, the expenses on a monthly basis and increase cash flow? Will they be applying for a bond through the bank or apply for funding through another credit provider? Would they apply for or use cash to purchase the property? Finance application time frame is also very, very important. So our OTP will typically state, apply through a bank or other credit provider, specifically not a registered credit provider, because they will not necessarily only make use of banks. So, and this is something we find on OTPs quite a lot, is the fact that, estate agents would want you to only make use of a bank, and they would only accept a quotation being received from the bank. And it's not necessarily according to the plans and the specifications of the investor's calculation, which could have an impact on the loan to value you receive from the bank, as well as the interest rate might be at a specific interest rate for you to consider. We will also then add to an investment opportunity or an OTP the due diligence clause within a specific time frame running concurrently with the finance application time frame. And we do this because, as you know, that there is in many cases an estimation done on the renovation costs, and there might be a crack or damage to the actual structure of the property, and we would need to get someone to go and do an evaluation and give a feedback or a structural report or a due diligence feedback report on the property before a final decision is made to move forward on a property opportunity. Right, managing expectations. What are investors looking for when considering an investment opportunity from the opportunity? So from the opportunity, we would look for something that's below market value, so that there's obviously space to be able to gain equity in the purchase. There should be positive cash flow after considering all deductions and expenses, which will include management, maintenance, vacancies, voids, insurance, security. And you will see a lot of advertisements that's been done either on Facebook where people say, the rental income covers the bond, and therefore this is actually then a negative cash flowing property and definitely not something a property investor would consider. If you then look at return on investment of 15% or more on a 2% higher than prime interest rate. So what investors will do is they will stress test the outcome of the cash flow of this project based on 2% higher than the current interest rate. So currently 8.25, so they will also stress test it on about 10.25. I've seen investors that stress test it at 3% higher. And as we all know, the interest rates are going up, so it would be reckless for any investor not to stress test it and see if it will actually work on a higher interest rate. The bond affordability value for the deal. So if, depending on the entity as well as the joint ventures and how they're going to raise finance, that could play a big role with regards to the affordability. And second of all, there's also the cash required to successfully complete the opportunity. And I'm sure as any estate agent would normally qualify their purchaser they would also need to know that they have the information and the funding ready for, you know, the acquisition costs, your bond costs, your transfer costs, your holding costs, you know, the certifications, you know, that's required at, you know, well, more from a seller perspective, but in some instances, investors are also negotiate with the seller in order to do those, you know, certificate of compliances on their behalf. And that's actually a very valid point from an investor perspective. We really try and aim to make an opportunity work. And if the seller is not able to actually come up with a COC certificate, that's something that can be negotiated. And, you know, an OTP is, you know, anything you can negotiate. That is the important part of it. Right. Also from that perspective, from you as an agent, all we require from you as the agent is to know your product. We get to a lot of cases or properties where the estate agent don't have any information about the property that they're selling. If we're asking about rates and taxes, the listing rates and taxes value would differ from the Lightstone and also differ from the municipal. And then you ask them for a copy of the rates and taxes or the municipal statement, they can't get it, they will need to request it. And I think a lot of the documentation and, you know, it will is possible to obtain from the seller in order to make this process or this journey much easier. So we also like the estate agent to be confident, professional, helpful and friendly. We really do get people that don't really want to work with this, with investors, and that's fine. But I think, you know, being friendly and helpful doesn't cost a lot. Assist with the requested information, and this, as described above, this will shorten and assist with the decision-making and finance application process. And that is so true. I think, you know, for an investor to derive at, you know, the offer price and to be able to provide you with all the information you require, obtaining this will really shorten that process. What about the area? So from an area perspective, an investor would look at approximately 4% on average market value growth over the last 10 years, which can also be obtained from various places like Lightstone or from the Property 24 and so forth. The tenant repayments should be above the national good standing, which you can also obtain from your TPN reports. There should be demand, rent out quickly at a reasonable rental value. This is very important, especially for multi-let opportunities. And then the demand for a higher number of transfers, and this is very important for investors, especially when they want to flip a property, to see that actually properties get listed and sold and the numbers of properties moving, you know, in this area is high. And then also the amenities in the area. So for instance, universities for student accommodation, is that close by? You can understand like transport is going to play a huge role in that instance as well. So important factors for us is, as an investor, is gross yield is one of the indicators that we would look at. But I'm going to emphasize the fact that this is only an indicator for us to see if there is a possibility of obtaining cash flow, as most investors purchase properties for cash flow, and secondly for the capital gains, which is not always, you know, secured. That is something that you will only grow over time, and you don't know if it's going to go up or down. But it is important to be able to see if the property will be able to give cash flow. And gross yield calculation is what we actually take the annual gross rental income that you can achieve from the property, and you divide it by the asking price for the property. If that value is below 15%, the investor will probably not look at the opportunity. The indication below 15% is basically just saying that if you have your prime interest rate and all of the expenses like your rates, taxes, your holding cost, your maintenance management and so forth, you know, below 15%, the chance of that property cash flowing is going to be very slim, unless you are able to increase your rental income or decrease the purchase price of that property. But where we do make buying decisions is obviously with the return on investment. It's a little bit of more complicated calculation, but this is where investors will make buying decisions. This is where you take your annual net cash flow after all the deductions, how much money is left over for your cash flow perspective. So that's net cash flow, and you divide it by the capital invested in the opportunity. Not the value that you receive from the bank, but the capital that you invested. So that might just be your renovation cost. It might be your acquisition and your holding costs or your renovation costs together. It might include a deposit, but it's not what you receive from a bank if you actually applied from a bank, to just give a quick indication. Obviously, the very important part is the net cash flow in this instance, because that's going to have a direct impact on the return on investment that you will obtain from a project. The best deal is where everyone benefits, and I think that's very important. Investors are there to make sure that they can find an opportunity that works for everyone in the deal, and that is from the seller to the agent, to the buyer, to the team that will be used in between for renovation costs. Everyone in there must be satisfied with the outcome of the opportunity, and that is the only time when we actually do see this as a good opportunity. And therefore, it's important for agents, I think, as a side note, to be aware of the fact of what types of properties to approach investors with. If you are expecting to sell this property to a first-time buyer, then don't approach an investor. If the property has been on the market for a long time and you can't get it sold and the seller is willing to negotiate, then probably that's a good property opportunity to bring to an agent. And I've basically spoken before the next slide, so let's just go through this. The perfect seller for a property investor is someone who's motivated, and the motivation can be twofold. It is either because of finances, that they are distressed in finances, or they are distressed because of a time frame, that they need to move to another country or another town, and they need to sell the property quickly in order to move in a different town. And they must be willing to negotiate below market values for their property. We've also seen quite a lot of times, and this is an arguable point, where the expectation has been set too high for the seller on what they can reasonably get for their property in the condition that the property is. I'm not talking about new properties that's on the market. I'm talking about all the properties which fit the criteria for a property investor. So the perfect property for a property investor is the worst house in the best street, which is good because that means that we can add value and bring the property back into the market value. Property on the market for a long time, as I indicated, because they are then motivation has gone up to sell. They're probably more negotiable on the selling price of the property. Little renovations required. So we're not scared for renovations, but it always make your life much easier if you do find opportunities with little renovations. And that can also have an impact on the actual strategy that is selected for the opportunity. The option to expand or increase value. So can they add another flatlet? Can they add another room to the property? All of that is possible opportunities. And you can always see on a property if it's a corner stand and there is two entrances to the property as an example, and you can really split it so that there's privacy between the two tenants, so that you can convert the garage and the staff quarters into a flat that can be used maybe for Airbnb or just a normal flatlet, is one point. And the other side is then the house. That is actually increasing value from a rental income perspective on a specific property. Or you can just add another bedroom, make it a 4-bedroom and not having a 3-bedroom, because there's a huge jump in the market value between those two values or those types of properties, and that becomes an important part. So that is, in short, something that I've now given to you guys, which normally takes about 2 days for me to go through in detail with sourcing agents and investors. So yeah, I hope if there's any other questions, we'll obviously stay behind to be able to answer those. And thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nico. That's always incredible. Always incredible. I always get so much when I speak to you, though, because I suppose that's the one thing about property investing and investors and that sort of thing is they do tend to push the boundaries quite a bit. And each time you have a conversation, I have a conversation like this with you, I see that you've come up with something new, a criteria or a new parameter that you want to work around, or a new indicator. And as like from a law perspective, it's always like then rushing to try and find a way of making it work and seeing whether it's possible and seeing if we can put something in a contract that allows for it. So it's really cool because it's very insightful. Like I don't think 1 week goes by where I don't get challenged on, but can we do this? Okay, fine. Let me sit back and try figure it out, and let's try to do it. So thank you again, Nico. That was really cool.
It's a big pleasure. Thank you, Bruno.
Cool. So next up, we're going to be discussing some legal solutions. So that's exactly why I put Nico first. So Nico pushes the boundaries, comes up with certain ideas, comes up with context, the indicators, a whole range of things, different strategies. And then my job is to take those strategies and see if I can fit them in neatly within some kind of a legal context so that it's enforceable, so that, you know, the investor's rights are protected or the seller's rights are protected, or, you know, whatever the case is. So that's what we're going to be discussing next. We're going to be looking at some of the most recent options or recent solutions that we've been working with. These are your typical ones. I mean, there's a lot of very unique, creative things, but unfortunately, I mean, we don't really have the time to go into that much detail right now, and it does start getting very advanced and specialized. But this is something that, from experience, we find that not many estate agents know about. So your more experienced agents naturally would, because they would have come across this once. They would have come across this, you know, a couple of times. I've worked with many estate agents around this, and I've seen that, you know, it does make their life easier as soon as they understand what these concepts are, what they do, how to manage them, how to make commission from them. And I think that's the difficulty, is as soon as we go against the grain when it comes to buying and selling. There's a contract, I buy from you, I'm expected to perform within a certain period of time, and then and you're selling your property, and it all happens right now. And as soon as the conveyance is done, we're going to go property is registered, property's been transferred, and it's done. Whereas with some of these solutions, it doesn't really work like that. A lot of it has, you know, a lot of it is deferred in time, so it takes a little bit longer than everything else. Or some of them involve multiple parties, which means that you need to manage people. So that's where we're going now. We've got until 11:05, so that gives me a good half an hour to bore you with law. But yeah, I'm definitely going to try and make it as interesting as possible. So yes. Sorry, before I go there, let me actually break this down just a little bit in detail. So I've taken the creative investment solutions and tried to break it down into 3 categories. All right. Now you've got the institutional financing. Now I think most of you are used to this institutional financing from the perspective of, you know, you can get a loan from a private person or an institution. You can do it through a bank. So like loans aren't necessarily always through banks. I mean, there's a lot of funders out there that want to fund projects. This starts getting a bit more on the commercial side of things, where you start getting private funding or joint ventures in the venture capital space. So that does exist, but it's not something that, you know, it's not really run of the mill. It's more the exception rather than the rule. So from the institutional financing perspective, we tend to focus on banks, right? Your buyer wants to buy a property, they approach a bank, and the bank does an assessment on this buyer. Now, this is done in a variety of different ways, and these assessments, Lisa will be touching on in a bit more detail later on. But the way that the bank approaches you also depends on the structures that you use. And that is key, because you're going to get a lot of guys, for example, that might qualify today, but they want to buy their second property or their third property, and all of a sudden they don't qualify. Why? Because they get a certain income, be it like a salary or self-employed or whatever the case is, and they go get loans in their personal names, which means that from the National Credit Act perspective, their affordability starts getting capped. And that's the risk of investors not thinking 2 steps ahead and asking the question, but how am I going to get my second, my third, my fourth, my fifth property? How do I access that now? I need to know from day one how to access that, because the unfortunate thing is, if in day one you make a mistake, it's going to be very difficult to fix it later. We can fix it, but then it's going to cost a lot more money than doing it right from day one. I can guarantee you this. And I've got example after example. If anyone here wants to come speak to me and have a conversation around this, there's no question. There's no disputing it. I've seen it happen a million times, and I've been stuck with the task of later having to move properties from people's personal names into companies just to increase their affordability so they can buy more properties. Investor after investor, and these are good investors. Some of them are sitting with 20 properties already, The problem is now they want their 21st property and they're stuck with the first 5 or 6 that they bought initially, and that's impacting their affordability. So very important for you as estate agents to educate your clients, because remember, as an agent, you guys would look out for the seller's best interest, sure, but you also want to get the sale across the line, and you want to make sure that this purchaser manages to buy the property, but also comes back to you time and time again and makes the right decisions. By imparting this knowledge on them, you are definitely going to get a very happy buyer that is going to come to you because they feel that they understand or that you understand what their needs are. So that's the institutional financing perspective. Sorry, I just kind of went off on a tangent there. The second one is the no financing perspective. So all this means is you're buying a property, but you've got effectively, you could have zero money or very little money. You could have like a bit of cash in hand, whatever, you've saved up a couple of 100,000 or even just 100,000, whatever the case is. So at the one solution that we have under that we don't really have a lot of money, or the bank is not willing to give us money, is the back-to-back flipping, right? So this is a strategy that Nico alluded to briefly. I'm going to go into the legal of it so you guys understand what it is, how it works, why it's allowed, and how you as estate agents can actually make it happen. Because, I mean, if you have a guy wanting to flip the property, still a good guy. Yes, you might feel that there's better guys out there that will close the deal today. But I mean, let's be fair. There's a lot of competition out there. So if you can make a deal happen that's a back-to-back deal, you might actually land up with 2 sets of comm if you can sell the property onto somebody else and find one person willing to buy from the initial purchase. So I'll touch on this briefly, and then private financing. So as opposed to institutional financing that's geared around financing properties or businesses, like, for example, business partners, you work with them a lot. They finance student accommodation, finances inner city buildings. So those are all institutional, and they're not your typical banks. Business partners is not a bank. It's more venture capitalist, joint venture partner. Now, your private financing is taking that large institutional scale and dropping it into a private scale. So you get the same options. You still get the one-on-one loans. I have money, you want to buy a property, I'm going to give you money to buy that property. You've got the JVs, very similar concept. You want to buy a property, I've got cash or I've got something I can offer to this joint venture. I go in it with you, right? And normally you'd start a company, you'd have different shareholding. Each person would be entitled to some level of benefit. Each person would be obligated to make some sort of contribution to this. So these are all contracts that us as lawyers put into place to make deals work. Why is this relevant for estate agents? You have a purchaser, you might even have 2 purchasers looking at similar properties, both have issues with each other. You could actually join these guys together and get the deal happening because these guys JV with each other. From an investor perspective, that's key. That's how investors actually get into deals very often. Yes, your first-time home buyer wouldn't want to do this because you want to own and live in the property. So he's not interested in sharing with anyone else. But if from an investor perspective, you need to start thinking outside the box. There's ways of putting consortiums together. There's ways of taking people that have more money and people that have certain expertise in renovations and grouping them together and letting them go off on their own. So that's the joint venture sphere. Then we've got the seller financing sphere. So under this, we've got installment sale agreements and something that's called the Kistings brief. I'm not going to go into too much details of the Kistings brief because you don't see it all that often. The installment sale agreement, that is key. Absolutely key. The trend on the use of installment sale agreements within the last 5 years has shot up tremendously. I mean, this specific legislation that allows for installment sale agreements has been around since about 1973, if I'm not mistaken. And what we saw was a trends. Depending on where we are from an economic perspective, the trends keep changing. And recently, it's been a big thing. I spoke about this about 6 years ago at quite a big event. And at that point, no one knew what this was about. And I spoke about it because I saw that, people are going to want to start getting into deals without having to fork out a lot of money up front and possibly not getting money from the banks, and that this was a fantastic way of doing it if you could convince the seller to go for it. And it's since then, every week I get questions about this. So definitely something to consider. So two things I'm going to be discussing now: flipping and installment sale agreements. So first off, flipping. Now, just maybe just a brief discussion. Sorry, I just want to open my slide a bit bigger. Okay, that one. All right, so just a quick discussion on what is back-to-back flipping for those that don't know. Many of you would know, so this might just be repetitive. I apologize. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what it is because it's quite a simple concept. So ultimately, person X sells the property to person Y. Person Y, in essence, being the investor, right? Person Y, the investor, intends to resell the property to person Z. So now there's three parties. It's X, Y, and Z. X is selling to Y, Y is selling to Z, right? So now So why would Y want to do this, right? Now, the capital flip or the flipping strategy is about getting quick money in, right? So you want to buy at this price, you want to sell at this price. So there's a level of value that you get somewhere in the middle. Now, this value can be achieved in a variety of different ways. There's no set rule. So I used to have clients, for example, that used to buy at sheriff's auctions. Now, they got their value because sheriff's auctions were notoriously good at keeping prices down. So they got their value immediately by attending these auctions and taking the risk of there being occupiers fighting you and there being amounts outstanding to the municipality. So there's a lot of risks that that sheriff's auctions have, as an example, and they used to take those risks, and as a reward almost for taking those risks, they used to be able to get the properties at better prices. So a lot of the properties they were able to sell without, because they knew what risks to take and they knew how to manage that. So that's key. It wasn't an easy process, but they understood the market so well that they knew what to buy, they knew how to manage those risks, and that's where I came in to assist with evictions and occupier management and things like that. And from that perspective, they're actually able to sell the property onto somebody else by taking away those risks. And the value or the profits that they made, say it was 200, 300,000, was simply because of that risk component. There were no renovations. They did nothing to these properties. They simply just took away that risk component and sold it to somebody else who didn't want to take that risk, right? So they got their value by mitigating risk. Other people, for example, will do renovations. So you buy a property, and a couple of things need to be done. You need to fix this. You need to fix the ceiling, paint the roof, paint the wall, install a new gate, fix the pool, that sort of thing. All of that costs money. Current owner cannot sell this property because, remember, it's not a direct, and I mean, you guys would know this, there's no direct link between what the cost of repair is to what the value of the property is. And I think that's a very key concept. If you walk into a property as an investor, your mind's going to numbers saying that's going to cost 30, that's going to cost 100, 200, like full amount, 340,000 is going to cost me to renovate this property. But it's not always as simple as a seller dropping the purchase price by 340 and expecting everyone to want to buy. Because a purchaser's perception, especially as a first-time home buyer, when they go to the property, they're not interested that you drop the price sometimes by 340, because in their mind, it's a complete dump and no one would ever want to live here. So it's just a consideration where a property investor has a different way of approaching things, and that's why their pricing, the pricing with them works differently. So if they can find value in a property or in a property deal, that's where they're going to make their profit. So that's the back-to-back flip. So the person why, so why would Y do this? Is because they can make profit from it. Another reason that we sometimes find that the strategy works really well among people is the fact that if Y does not have enough money to pay X, the purchase price, by doing a back-to-back. So what I was speaking now is flipping. But flipping, you can very easily flip, still take ownership and sell on to someone else. Back-to-back is very specific to I buy and sell immediately without ever taking transfer of the property or without keeping transfer of the property for a very long period of time. Now, that's the back-to-back strategy that you guys want to have, that you guys want to understand. So ultimately, the person buying the property from the seller would use his purchaser's money to fund the initial deal. So X sells to Y, Y sells to Z, Y uses Z's basically affordability, his bank guarantees, to pay for the property that he just bought from X. And you do this all in one transaction. You link the two transfers together, and you can do a flip without having to get a bond in your own name. It's totally legit. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. Yes, there are risk components that all parties need to understand, but if all parties are happy to take those risks, it's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. The banks also don't really have an issue with it because you tell them what your guarantee requirements are, and all the bank wants is they will only pay out that amount once the bond is registered in their favor. So if the bond's not registered in their favor, no one's getting a cent. They don't care who gets the money. They just want the security registered. Short of that, they're happy to issue the guarantee in favor of X if they have to, right? So we can have a greater discussion about this if you guys want. We can even have one specific discussion just dedicated on flipping, but that's basically the long and short of it. So the sell and transfer from X to Y and from Y to Z are linked. They happen at the same time. So what to look out for in a back-to-back deal? Sorry, I just want to expand my screen a bit. Yes, there we go. So what to look out for in a back-to-back flip? So just a couple of little pointers. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around it, but it applies. So if you're buying the property, you as an investor are buying the property, or your client as an investor is buying the property, or your seller comes to you and you find someone wanting to buy, but they want to do a flip. It can apply to any property. What you're often going to find is the investors will have to include some form of exit clauses, because if the deal only makes sense on a back-to-back basis, and why would it only make sense? Simply because if you're doing it as a back-to-back, you only need to go to the municipality once for the clearance figures. So there's a time component to it that saves you time. There's sometimes even a transfer cost component to it, because if you're using the same attorneys to do both transfers, you're typically going to get better rates from the attorneys as well. So from an investor perspective, the back-to-back makes sense. You don't need to apply for a bond. You don't need to pay initiation fees to the bank. You don't need to do any of that, right? So, but they normally include exit clauses that make it suspensive. So things like, for example, due diligence. That's a typical one that you see across the board on most of the sales. A loan approval. So a lot of the guys would include this if they do have affordability as an example, but they'd rather flip. But push comes to shove, push comes to shove, if they really, really have to, they're happy to take transfer of the property and sell it on later. So there would obviously still be the loan approval suspensive condition there, and then the simultaneous sale condition. Now, and this is a big one. So whether when buying from a seller, X, in our example, Y, if Y is buying from X, whether he's going to be able to use all of these clauses, whether he's going to be able to buy enough time and make it subject to him finding a purchaser to resell, would be very dependent on whether the seller is actually willing to do this. And that's why it's, a lot of these investors have to be very careful. They take chances because they make the offers, they make it subject to them obtaining finance, and because they know that if they can't find someone to buy the property, they might be in the deal, or they might have to breach, or something along those lines. So that's something to be careful for. Your seller sometimes dictates the terms, which means that the investors need to kind of work behind the scenes to make things happen. And you as an estate agent might not always know that that's the seller, that's the purchaser's intention. But if you guys speak the same language with this purchaser, you might actually be able to work with them and make the deal happen, because now you understand what they're doing and what you need to do as an agent to get the deal through. And then, so if any renovations are necessary when buying the property, because obviously if you're flipping it, you might want to fix a few things so that you can sell it on to somebody else. Like I mentioned, that's sometimes the component that adds value to the property. You do obviously need to have it in the contract. When you're selling the property, this is very crucial now, because if X is selling now to Z, we want to make sure that obviously, sorry, Y is selling to Z. You want to make sure that Y is covered. So no overpromising. They're buying the property. Typically, this, and you'll see down at the bottom, this relates a lot to defects. So allow for shorter performance times, because obviously now you've bought the property and you've spent a lot of time looking for someone. This person cannot take the exact same amount of time to get bond approval. So unfortunately, the second contract is going to need to be shorter. You can't allow this guy now to go try resell as well. That's not going to work, right? You can do back to back with 2 transactions. 3 transactions start becoming extremely complicated and simply, in my mind, do not work. They must include a clause for continued marketing. Must is a strong word. They don't have to, but you as an investor need to make sure that if one deal falls through, you can go on to the next person, next person, next person. So there's ways of drafting continued marketing clauses that make them very easy to manage and kind of speed up the process. Your typical one being first guy to get suspensive condition, to fulfill suspensive condition gets the deal full and final. And then you can even mess around with the pricing and things like that. And then it should include a clause just regarding defects. Now, this isn't a discussion on defects and things like that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but obviously from your guys' perspective, you should know that if X is buying the property, sorry, now I'm confusing myself. If Y is buying the property from X, obviously Y doesn't know anything about this property. He's totally reliant on what X has told him as to the condition of the property. And that's where the mandatory disclosure form comes in, where proper contracting with Z, telling them, I've never lived on this property, I've never had much experiences, I honestly don't know if there's anything wrong with it, but you're buying it at your own risk. Please go see this property, do an inspection, do whatever you want. Here's the mandatory disclosure form. This is the best that I can do. This is very crucial because you obviously don't want backlash where there's something wrong with the property and you haven't properly pointed out that there was no way that you would ever know that there was something wrong with the property, and that Z actually has a higher obligation on themselves to ensure that the property is in good condition. Moving on to installment sale agreements, I see that I've only got a couple of minutes left. Installment sale agreements, so maybe instead of going into a lot of detail on these slides, we can just have a conversation around them, because these slides are some of the FAQs. And I have this discussion with people, but normally after a grander discussion on what is an installment sale agreement. In terms of the Alienation of Land Act, there's a couple of ways of buying properties, but the 2 most common ways is you make an offer and the person accepts the offer, goes to the conveyances, transfers passed. The second way of doing it is by way of installments. Now, it's nothing complex. It's the same way that people would go to certain stores, and instead of buying a very expensive piece of equipment, like once off, they would pay for it over time. And this is normally done through some level of financing, and that's where your banks like Sasfin and Centrafin and all of those guys kick in, because they apply that sort of funding. They will actually buy it for you, and then you start paying them off in a loan capacity. So this is why we call it seller finance, because what you're doing as a purchaser is you're actually approaching a seller and you're asking them, please finance me, because you're the one technically that's not receiving their money that's due. I'm paying you off slowly over time. Is it okay? And what do I need to give you in exchange for this to happen? And that's the kind of conversation that you want to have with sellers regarding installment sale agreements. Now, and it's quite funny, the pushback I get from guys on the ground that don't necessarily deal with investors very often is, but who would do that? Why would you go sell your property and get it paid off over time as opposed to just selling it once off? It doesn't make sense to me. If the guy doesn't have money, do you even trust him to pay? Just go sell it to someone that can go to the bank and get bond approval. Now, a couple of things wrong with that statement. First thing is affordability isn't great for everyone. Let's be fair. Affordability at the price that you want is sometimes even rarer, because you will sell the property if the seller wants a specific price, but the people willing to pay that price might not be able to actually raise the financing for that price. So now you're limiting your options as to who you can sell to. Why would you want to sell to someone in installments? Maybe because there's a greater need. right at the beginning. I got involved in a deal, for example, where the guy was in debt. Got quite a huge amount of debt, and he needed, I think, around 300,000 Rand in order to get out of debt. And that was his key. That was his motivator, was 300,000 Rand to get out of debt. He was desperate for it. So as an agent, it's also crucial for you guys to understand where the seller's head is at, because simply knowing that the seller wants to sell the property and there's a specific price that they're willing to take, and there's a minimum price that they're willing to take, sometimes isn't enough, because there's different things that you can do to actually make deals happen. So this guy wanted a specific price, but he was more desperate to get the money. And what we realized is we weren't willing to pay that price, but we were willing to give him the money. In exchange, we wanted a better price and we wanted to pay the property off in installments so we wouldn't have to take the bond. Between a bunch of partners, we got 300,000 Rand together. We paid him the 300,000 Rand and he was happy. And we bought the property for a lot less below market value, but he didn't care because that 300 for him was the most important thing that he needed. He didn't actually care about the value of the property in the long term. He wanted that 300,000 Rand today, and rightfully so, because at 300,000 Rand today is more meaningful than trying to sell the property for 500,000 Rand more, but taking forever to get it, because the interest on that 300 and the trouble and the issues, and some people want to immigrate today and they don't want to wait for the properties to be sold, for the exact right price. So you can structure it in order to motivate a seller to want to take it. So you either offer money up front, for example, if it's a distressed seller that's desperate for cash right now. You might, for example, offer a higher price. So some installment sale agreements work because the seller only wants R1 million for the property, but you as a property investor offer 1.3 million, but in an installment sale agreement. And that, for you as an investor, that works great because you get the benefit of paying it off over time without getting a loan, and the seller technically gets 300,000 Rand more at the end of it. So it's from that perspective, it is definitely a win-win. So there's always ways of motivating why a seller might want to sell a property in installments. And there's a lot of investors out there that can make deals work, because if they take occupation of the property and they've got better skills to manage tenants, sometimes what you find is the seller selling the property has a great property on his hands, but they don't know how to manage tenants, or they're tired. They just don't have the energy to manage these tenants. And a young investor comes in and says, you know what, I'll buy the property, I'll pay it off in installments, give me occupation, I'll make sure your bond is covered, I'll throw a little bit extra on the top, walk away from this, and I'm going to manage this property. And they manage the property, they get double the rental income, and they've got more than enough money to pay the seller and pocket some. So, there's win-wins in situations like this. What estate agents sometimes ask me, which is important, is, but it's frustrating because now with installment sale agreements, how do you make money and how do you earn commission? On a normal sale, it's easy. And I mean, on a back-to-back, it's very easy. You can, when the bank pays out, you make your money, you charge your com, and there you go. You've done your job, you've made your money. But as in an installment sale agreement, where's the money? How do you do it? So granted, there is no set rule or principle on how to deal with this, but you as an estate agent, at least being aware of the possibilities of installment sale agreements will then also allow you to factor something in. So maybe, as an example, with installment sale agreements, no one is compelled to pay a deposit. Similar with a private sale, no one has to pay a deposit. But maybe in structuring this deal, you need to have a conversation with the people to say, look, my com is 50K, my com is 100K. So this 100K is payable as soon as this deal closes and as soon as you guys start moving forward with this. It doesn't matter whether we factor it in as a deposit that's payable by the seller or whether you change your mandate so that the purchaser pays you the com directly, but it becomes key that 100,000 Rand has to be deposited somewhere before this deal actually takes effect. And you can do something like that in order to make sure that it happens. Otherwise, as an example, You could take a portion on a monthly basis. A lot of estate agents do this when they see that the deal's going to go ahead. They'll take a percentage every month, every month, every month. And yeah, I mean, it works for them. Now, another thing to also remember, because the next question that I normally get is, but how secure is this? And now I can quickly go through the question. So how long can an installment sale agreement be? There's no limitation, although 5 years seems to be a very comfortable space because that's what the banks are actually willing to consider when allowing for an installment sale agreement over a property that they have a bond over. So I normally say try focus around 5 years, but you could, if you needed to, you could have it for longer. The next question is, does the seller need to be registered as a credit provider? When selling the property, even if it's for a higher price, for example, it's still okay because there's a value to that. It's a perceived value on what the property is worth. It's only if the seller starts charging interest that it starts getting considered as a credit provider. So if the seller simply sells the property at a purchase price but divides the payment over a period of time, there's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to be registered as a credit provider. Is there a risk that the seller sells the property behind a person's back? Not if this is done properly, simply because you register the contract at the deeds office. So no one can sell the property because there's a contract at the deeds office saying that somebody's already bought the property and that they're paying it off in installments. What happens if the seller passes away? If the seller passes away, the contract typically continues. If the seller is declared insolvent, as an example, what happens there is you as a purchaser have the first right. So you can enforce that contract. You go out, you get a bond, and you pay the purchase price the way that is. You get first right. If you can't, then it's a bit more of an issue because then you become a creditor in the insolvent estate. So that's the bankruptcy. And is the private bond a more suitable alternative? I don't think we need to go over that now. Like I mentioned, that's the Christings brief. It's not popular. It barely gets much traction. I've only done 1 or 2 of them myself. Is the deposit a legal requirement? No, but you as an estate agent may want to make sure that a deposit is factored in so that you can get your money. Then both the Alienation of Land Act and the contract governs breach. So it's just important to know it's not just about the contract. Alienation of Land Act has very strict requirements when it comes to installment sale agreements. So you may very well want to understand the act a little bit more, use an attorney that understands it, because there's certain minimum requirements. So for example, the contract has to be recorded at the deeds office. Otherwise, technically, the purchaser is not liable to make any payments. Early settlement is possible, so the purchaser can, decide during the contract to apply for a bond and pay for the full purchase price. A commencement of renovations that can be governed in the contract if needed. That one is a long discussion, so I'm going to leave that for now. And yeah, that's a tax conversation. So that's something we're going to leave for a tax conversation at some point, totally dedicated to that. So those are the 2 primary legal solutions or creative legal solutions that we've come up with. Primary, by what I mean primary, is the most commonly used. So if you guys get exposed to that and you need to have a conversation with an investor around that or a conversation with the seller around that, at least you guys now have an understanding of what it entails. But I'd still strongly suggest if it happens, come through to me. Let's have a conversation because we can run the process for you, which is also nice because we work with the agents. So if you as an agent come to us and say, look, this is what I'm thinking this, I can make the deal work by packaging like this. What do you think? Can you help? We'll jump in there. We'll do the contracts. We'll assist you with the transfers, that sort of thing. A kind of a project management component until you get used to it and you know what to look out for and you know what the contract should say. And then obviously you can do more of it yourself without an attorney necessarily assisting. So I'm not saying an attorney has to be involved. I'm just saying from experience, this is a little bit specialized. So we do typically tend to jump in and walk the journey with you guys. So that's it from the legal solutions perspective. So now just very briefly for the next couple of minutes, like 6 minutes or so, Now, going back to investors. So now we've discussed what an investor is looking for, what the property should look like, how they typically run the numbers, what you'd want to approach an investor with. Then we had the discussion of, great, so now you understand the investor. How do you structure the deal so that they get the best out of it? How do you get into deals with it? You've identified the properties. How do you get them to now invest in these properties? Do you flip it? Do you buy it in installments, whatever the case is? Now, for a second, let's assume that the deal goes through and now you've got an investor that actually owns the property. Now, the next conversation, and this actually is a feature on my eviction and leasing discussion, or my eviction and leasing module, is just management of the investor and management of tenants. Now, this is crucial. It applies a lot more to rental agents, but I'm only literally going to give it 5 minutes, so sales agents don't need to jump off. It's just going to be a 5-minute conversation. Why I throw this in here, though, is if we're going to speak about investors, there's no point only keeping an investor for the sale and walking away from this, because this investor now needs to find tenants. He needs to make the deal work. Either it's a multi-let, might be student accommodation, might be just a normal single let. The bottom line is there's going to be tenants involved, and this is where your rental book might be able to take over extra business, and you might actually be able to retain this client for life, which is what we're working towards, which is what we want to see. So from an investor perspective, guys, very crucial. Remember, you need to manage the person, not the property. And this applies from both perspectives, both the landlord and the tenant, because both have different mindsets that need to be managed. If you focus only on managing the property, what you're going to find is there's going to be shortcomings, because people don't have the same understanding as you. Yes, you're property practitioners, but what gives you the strength, or what gives you the best advantage, is that you know property so well that you don't need to sit and only look at the property. You need to start working at the people around the property. So when I say expectation management, as an investor, what can the investor expect to receive? What does actual property management entail? So like leasing management and that sort of thing. The rentals, the cash flows, things like that. They need to understand this. It needs to make sense to them. So if you see that a person's buying a property for investment purposes, this should be your automatic next step, is to go, well, you know what? It's a great property. You should buy it, but check this out. If you rent it out, this is the money you can make. We have many tenants in this specific area. Here's the demand for properties in this area. You could even put it up as a test to see what sort of interest is shown for what sort of price, so that you can prove to this person that they should go through you, because you can do a full turnkey solution for this. So expectation management. Also, when it comes to things like defaulting and things like that, expectation management. You want to keep these investors. So you don't want to be in a situation where they only stay with you as long as things are good, but as soon as things go bad, they've got no fundamental understanding on what the process entails, what an eviction entails, what a breach entails, sending out a notice, a letter of demand, that sort of thing. So this is why I normally do this topic, under the leasing and evictions, because I go into quite a bit of detail on it. But I do know that Nicoline does have the video, the recording from the previous session, so it's not outdated. You guys are welcome to jump on, or I'm happy to do like a refresher if needed. But managing that expectation from an investor perspective is very key, because you want to keep them as clients. You don't want them to have unrealistic expectations of you as an agent. A mindset of managing occupiers, very similar. Now we turn to tenant management. And depending what sort of properties you're dealing with, you need to manage these tenants, not the property. You need to understand what's going through their mind. You need to tie them in. So now I don't have to speak to a lot of the rental agents about this to a great degree, because I mean, this is what you guys are trained at. But The reality behind it is what I find from a breaching perspective is by the time the tenants stop paying rent and I get involved to send out a letter or a notice or something like that, something's typically gone wrong. And that's what I try and avoid from a relationship perspective is you can keep these tenants under control to a certain degree as long as you've managed them in a very particular way. Yes, you know what, they might stay on a little bit longer unlawfully, or they might not pay rent for that amount of time, but you're managing them. What I've noticed sometimes is bad management of tenants leads to them staying for a hell of a lot longer, and resentfully so, or not resentfully, but with animosity rather, where they actually doing it because they don't care anymore. They've got no feeling towards the landlord or the agent. So this is more kind of just a warning around managing for property investors, because this is their bread and butter. A lot of these guys buy literally on the edge, not necessarily being able to afford these properties, but just knowing that there's going to be cash flow from them. So having conversations with them around rental guarantees is an example, something to consider, because it's something that might mitigate the risk on their behalf. Using lawyers as last resort, same thing I did in the previous discussion. We had a long conversation about managing tenants. I spoke about tenants in inner city and how they turn against landlords simply because of mob mentality. So if you've got multi-lets, you want to get involved and make sure that these tenants are all managed. Each individual tenant you've got contact with, you communicate with, you know what's happening. Obviously reacting fast, because that's also another thing that we notice is slow reaction when it comes to defaulting. So if you as this is crucial for investors, again, it's an investor conversation, because the investors are totally reliant on this. So if no proper lease agreements are in place, which obviously with you guys I doubt would be the case, you know, the vetting issues, especially with vetting issues. Remember, property investors also have a different mindset sometimes. It's not about getting the perfect tenant. It's about being able to maneuver around what type of tenants you're getting. You could find a tenant that has 1 or 2 defaults, but you see that this default was maybe during COVID, and it's something that they've you know, come back from. But yes, it's still on their record. It's still within the last 2 years, but they've come back from it really well. It might take a little bit extra effort, but you could probably get these guys, you know, good references. But tell your landlord that this is what you're doing, because some of those guys are willing to pay more for the property because they might be struggling to find properties, because every time they apply and get vetted, you know, some agency looks and says, well, you know, there's a bad mark here in your name, we're not giving it to you. Whereas some investors are willing to look past that. And we even had this conversation the other day with TPN. We had a panel discussion around, you know, don't just take it for what it says. Try and understand what the meaning behind bad listings are, and whether they're really bad listings or whether they're just, you know, bad luck, and manage them accordingly. And investors have this in mind. So if you guys speak this language, you can very easily speak to the investor around this. And then legal flow and solution process. And that's what I offer to all the agencies that I work with, is we start from the beginning. We look at your management, your rental management, and we make sure that your processes are perfectly in line so that your time periods work smoothly and seamless, because investors would also appreciate the fact that if there's a default on day 1, day 2, something happens, day 3, something happens, and there's actual communication with the landlord with respect to this, but they also see that actions consistently being taken. So yeah, those are just a couple of quick helpful pointers when it comes to management. And like I said, you know, it's basically like a small little snippet of what I discussed before. So yeah, if you got value out of it, I'm glad. If not, don't worry, I'm done now. Great. Now the next discussion is going to be from Lisa. This I particularly love. I work a lot within the space. I do think there's a lot of value behind this conversation, because a lot of investors think like this. So Lisa's just going to take you through a general investment analysis on what people do from a tax perspective, from a structuring perspective. Lisa, are you there?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. Good luck.
There we go. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. So I just thought that I would take you guys through a very basic client journey, just to give you guys a perspective of what you as an agent would have to know, sort of stepping into your client's shoes. Because what separates you from any other estate agent would be knowing certain knowledge that you can give to your clients and help them make certain decisions when it comes to property investment. As we know, like with COVID and everything, there are a lot of personal things that impact one's journey in property investment, such things such as financing, just personal affairs that need to be sorted out, because when you are in financial crisis, so to speak, you sort of start to cut your losses in certain areas that are not crucial, so to speak. So what I would like to do is go through these slides, sort of to help you. Oh goodness, sorry, I'm really bad at this. Just to help you understand what a client could be going through, and then just sort of expand on that. So we have two different clients over here. We have Thomas and we have Elias. So both couples, they're married in community of property, but we'll go through the different decisions they make and where you would come in as an estate agent to sort of help guide them make the right decisions, so that you can not only have a client and make a sale, but also retain this client lifelong, like Bruno said. So the first client we have over here, they're married in community of property, like I said, and they're interested in property investment. So he's super keen. They decide to go to approach a bank for finance to buy their first investment property that they're going to be leasing out. Our second client over here, they're a bit more hesitant, and they decide to approach professionals to get more insight as to how they can go ahead and start their investment journey on the right foot. What structuring they can have in place to ensure that not only can they set it up correctly, but also have a sustainable portfolio, which is where you as an agent would come in. Next slide. So the three principles we often use when dealing with structuring and certain vehicles is asset protection, financing optimization, and tax efficiency. So as a natural person, there are certain benefits that you have, such as certain exemptions, certain rebates, certain write-offs. But when going into a business venture like property investment, it is not necessarily the best option. The reason for this is because you are immediately exposed to risk, along with creditors, etc. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you'll expose your family or your personal finances to this property investment portfolio that you now have, because it is so risky and volatile, as we've seen with COVID times. So that's when we look at these two vehicles, trust and companies. So the first perk is that trust and companies both continue in perpetuity. There is no lifespan of a company or a trust, which is the downfall with a natural person, because as certain as anything is, you will eventually die one day as a natural person. So with the trust and companies continuing in perpetuity, you have this aspect of you can always change the shareholders and directors of a company. You can always change the trustees and the beneficiaries of the trust, which I'll get a bit into a moment of how that can benefit you as well. So now we know that companies are taxed at 28%, and we know the trust are taxed at 48%. And often with the trust specifically, this kind of throws a few people off, because why would you want to be taxed at a higher tax bracket if you already aren't at that tax bracket in your personal capacity? I will then get into the conjurer principle a bit later on when I discuss the tax aspect. So using a company, you also have the limited personal liability. So you step away from that liability you would have as a natural person, where now you are liable for all the expenses that you incur. You're completely exposed to creditors, whereas within a company, you sort of ring fence that risk. It now sits purely within the company, so any risks that you have will not affect you in your personal capacity. So going forward, if you're an estate agent, you can obviously recommend maybe register a company, have this property or these properties in a company, have it function as a going concern, as an actual company with all these properties inside of it. And this also later on can help with affordability, which I'll also get into. Additionally, you can also have a trust. What you would do with the trust is you can sell the shares of the company to the trust. This way, you also separate yourself in your personal capacity from the shareholding of the company. So you'll have the trust right on top, owning the shares in the company, That way, once again, you mitigate that risk, you ring fence that risk, and you can have this company with all its properties in it, just functioning, generating income. And this is when we're going to go towards speaking a bit about the asset protection aspect as well as the financing aspect. So with asset protection, like we mentioned before, you want to keep your assets separate from you in your personal capacity, protect your family, your spouse, etc. So what you're then going to do is you will try to have assets with certain level of risk in different type of vehicles. So you would group low risk assets together, higher risk assets together. This way you won't be exposing the other assets within that company to the higher risk assets, so to speak. Now, as an estate agent, you're going to recommend this because you want to have a client with a sustainable portfolio, as I mentioned. You want them to keep coming back to you, make sure that their assets are protected, that they're having this positive experience. You imparted this knowledge on them, and they're like, wow, this is something that no other agent has ever mentioned to me. Instead, they're just so focused on making the sale, making commission, whereas I end up in a position, I now have these properties in my personal name, have been completely exposed to risk. Tenants aren't paying, I'm in debt, and now my family's at risk, I'm losing my personal home, I'm losing my vehicles, etc. So you're really gaining that interpersonal relationship with your clients, and they're seeing you on that one-to-one basis where you see them and they see you. Someone just mentioned that I can't see my slides. I'm not sure how to enlarge them.
Let's just double check. I can see the slides 100%. If you can just quickly in the chat box tell us who can't see the slides. Okay, Gwendoline, it might just be your internet connection. So if you want, you can quickly log off and log back on again, and it should be fine. Okay, Lisa, you can continue.
Okay, perfect. Right? So just like I said, you're now building that relationship with this person. So now, if they had this structure in place and they're able to continue this property journey, they might think, okay, you know what, let me go back to this agent who helped guide me right from the beginning, set the structure in place so that I could be successful. You're just retaining this person on a lifelong basis, and you have a client that stays with you. Okay, in terms of financing optimization, so this is really where you stand to benefit. So in your personal capacity, like Bruno said, your affordability can be impacted when you're an individual and you're obtaining all 3 or all 4 or 5 of these properties in your own personal name. Banks will no longer look at you as someone that they would like to finance going forward. So then your property journey might be cut short with 1 or 2 properties. One of them might have just be your personal home. And that's not something that is ideal as someone who's truly passionate wants to go into this property journey. But instead, if you advise your client, like, maybe you should make use of certain structures, maybe a company, then it's a different aspect. Although you would also stand suretyship for a company right in the beginning when obtaining finance, as you continue your journey and this company has built up a reputation, they keep all the tax affairs up to date, constantly have their annual financial statements up to date, and they see, wow, this is actually a real company, there's income here, because that is what the bank is looking at. Can I get my money back from this person if I give it to them? So once this company has been traded for an extended period of time, you start to fall to the side, and they're looking at this company as a whole. And now the banks are like, you know what, this person is slightly older. Maybe you're now in your 40s or 50s, and your affordability in your personal capacity is not what it used to be, but now you have a standalone company that speaks for itself, and it has money, and you will be able to get those loans to continue your property journey, which means you as an estate agent still has this client who's going to keep coming back to you, and you'll keep earning commission from the sales and purchases that happen within this company. The next slide, with tax efficiency. So obviously, we all know that tax is a very, very big deciding factor when it comes to any investment that one makes, because you like to have a return on investment without paying an arm and a leg in taxes. So as we said, it's very important to balance these 3 principles. You can't focus too much on asset protection because that will compromise your affordability if you only have 1 property per company so to speak, because now banks are not going to see it as an operating company, but rather just see, okay, this company has one property, this company has another property. There's nothing actually happening. There's not an influx of any capital within the company, etc. But also with financing optimization, you don't want to clump too many assets together in a single company, because now you're exposing yourself to all this risk because you've lessened your asset protection just to increase your financing optimization. But you also don't want to now go and try to get all these loans and have 40 properties of different risk levels in the same company. Now, as we move to tax efficiency, this is another thing that I would like to touch on, and I'll explain in a very personal capacity later on in the other slides. So with tax efficiency, as I said, it's something that you look at before making any large decision. So with the trust, it is taxed at the 45%, but there's likely a principle known as the conduit principle. This means that should you, as I mentioned, have the company's shares held by the trust, and you make certain beneficiaries, such as family members, children, whoever the case may be, they can be the beneficiaries of this trust. That way, if these individuals are sitting at a much lower tax bracket, you stand to benefit by paying out or distributing out certain rental income, etc., to the individuals rather than retaining it within the trust, because in that financial year, then the amount will be taxed in the hands of the beneficiaries rather than at the 45% of the trust. So when you look at your structure, you will then be looking at where you stand to benefit in the aspect of tax, because we don't evade tax. We just try to plan a bit more smartly. So like I said, also with companies being taxed at 28%, do you rather want to retain certain capital amounts and reinvest it in the company? Or would you like to pay out certain salaries within the company? So it's really about moving smartly, having money constantly flowing throughout the structure, reinvesting, having more money that you can actually end up using to purchase new properties. So it's a bit more wiggle room than you would have in your personal capacity, where you now own this company, you're receiving this rental income, you're now increasing your tax bracket, and then you're just getting taxed at a higher tax bracket, where you have these structures with these set tax rates, and you can sort of wiggle around in that aspect. Right, so in the example that I used with Thomas and Elias, I mentioned a little speed bump, which will sort of help you guys see like what could happen in practice. So Thomas and his wife, who initially had purchased the first property in their personal names, they decided to approach the bank and now to receive a loan in order to purchase another property. However, the bank denied this as Thomas's affordability was not ideal, and instead then he had to ask his wife to apply for finance instead, and she then acquired the property in her personal name. So right now we're sitting with Thomas. So they have their residential home. Thomas has one of the rental properties, and his wife now owns one. Whereas Elias, and they have set up the company and the trust right in the beginning, even before purchasing their first rental property, they already have the structure in place. So now that they have been in this operating business, their company has been generating income, they've been submitting their financial statements, they're a lot more attractive to the bank in that aspect because they see, okay, there's finance here, we can actually have a return. They are able to purchase this property because they are able to receive finance. Another speed bump then also affects how people look at structuring is the passing away of someone. So in this aspect, Elias and Thomas's father has passed away. He left behind an unsigned will. I'll get into that a bit later, but essentially, if the will is not signed, it cannot be executed, and the wishes that are in the will cannot go through, and then you'll have to devolve the estate interstate, which means that if there was no will, and that way it's distributed to all sort of the descendants of the person who has passed away. So in practice, we all know there are a lot of blended families these days. A lot of people have stepkids, adopted kids, or just someone who is now with a new partner who had their own children. So there are many different family dynamics, and I'm just going to get into how that can also affect your estate planning and different structures. So the father had 4 additional children outside of his initial marriage, and now because of this unsigned will, because there were no family trust in place, no beneficiaries, nothing stated, because it had to devolve interstate, now sort of the father's estate has to be divided by more people, so to speak. So there have to be more beneficiaries than were initially planned, because if you plan early on, you can sort of make provision for these unforeseen circumstances later on. So now Thomas uses his small inheritance, which has been limited by a large amount because now it has to be divided by an additional amount of people. He uses that to purchase another property. Whereas had his father planned properly early on, he would probably have had a lot more, he would have had a bigger inheritance that he could have used to invest more into his property journey. So the same case happened with Elias. The father hadn't planned for it. He had minor children. So if those of you don't know, minor children cannot inherit from a will, or however the case may be directly, they cannot inherit money. So what will happen is, in your will, if you don't state that you have a certain guardian, somewhere you'd like the money to go to, it will go into the guardian's fund and will be managed however the guardian's fund deems fit. So your child will not benefit if they're a minor and you pass away without you having certain structures in place to benefit this minor child, such as a family trust, which you could make a minor child a beneficiary of. And you would have these trusted trustees that would be able to distribute to these minors up until the age of 18. So that was just a little side note as well. So now the lessons learned from this, the passing of the father. So now Thomas decides to drop the signed will because now he has children. Elias decides to update his will, ensuring that his minor children will not stand to lose at his passing, and has a family trust set up, as I said. Now, like I mentioned, the benefit of the trust is you can always change trustees, you can always change beneficiaries, and continues in perpetuity. Another perk is that you never gain ownership if you're a beneficiary of a trust. You just have the use and enjoyment of certain assets. So as I said, as you can change the trustees, you can change the beneficiaries. If you're now married into a new family and you would like to add or take away and have different people become beneficiaries, that's something that you can always do because it's ever evolving. Now, as I mentioned, here, Thomas is incredibly upset as to how CGT, transfer duties, and other costs have depleted his father's wealth. And now we're going to move to the next slide and I'll get into that a bit better. So with tax efficiency, reverting the back, so like I said, it's unavoidable that we're all going to die one day. And at your death, unfortunately, there are certain expenses that you cannot avoid if you do not plan properly early on. So if you die and your estate is worth 10 million, you're already going to be paying the state duty of 20% because you fall within the 3.5 million to 30 million sort of bracket. This is already 20%. If at your death you are in the higher tax bracket of 45%, that's another additional percentage that's going to be deducted from your total wealth. Then we have master's fees, you have deathbed expenses, you have all of sort of these deductions that you're taking away from this wealth that you had. And then we're going to talk about transfer duties and why it's always a benefit to have structures in place. So you pass away, you have this entire property investment portfolio of 15 plus properties. Because remember, if you are successful, you're going to have a larger estate. So now you pass away, this is a deemed disposal that immediately triggers capital gain taxes. On top of that, all of these assets need to be transferred to the heirs or whichever beneficiaries they are. So now you're paying that additional amount of money to transfer those properties from this deceased person's personal name into the person who inherits these properties. Whereas if you just had them all in a centralized company or trust, you would not have to deal with that transfer because they're staying in that company, they're staying within that trust. And so then the only changes that are happening are the trustees, the beneficiaries, the shareholders, the directors. So you're not having these massive transfer duty amounts that you have to deal with. Instead, you're just making these small changes, which even at the master, you can change trustees and you don't even have to necessarily pay for that. So as an estate agent, if you're able to give your clients this insight, if you'll be able to show them a bird's eye view of what their future might look like and help them set these structures in place early on and make these decisions, they'll see you as someone that has their best interest at heart and is not only focused on making commission off of them. They'll see you as someone that is more valuable to them than somebody else. They'll keep returning to you because they see, okay, yes, I might spend an extra amount of money now, but I save so much later on because I won't have to be paying these transfer duties. I won't have to deal with CGT, etc. So they're seeing you as this person that they can truly invest in, that they can have a retained relationship with. And going forward, you have this long-lasting client that will continue to come back to you and even refer different clients to you because you have this edge. You have knowledge that other estate agents might not have. And then we have the next slide. So now we talk about another event that might happen, God forbid, in some people's lives, such as divorce. So like I mentioned initially, so Thomas had the one property, his wife Kelly applied for financing the other property. Now they get a divorce. Already, because they were out of community of property, now there's a complete separation. This is, Kelly applied for this bond in her personal name, this is her property, this is Thomas, this is his property. So the portfolio already split. Whereas with Elias and Tiffel, even though they got a divorce, they still did it within this company that now, even though in their personal capacity, they're no longer together, they still have this company, this trust, this set up entirely. So no matter who, like I said, no matter if the directors are changing, whatever, they still stand to benefit from this company because they're still shareholders or directors in this company together. But now we're basing it off of Thomas and Kelly that had this in their personal capacity. So their personal affairs affect that. And now the portfolio sort of starts to move and you lose and gain different properties. I also mentioned how going forward, you can also have trusts for different purposes. So as you can see, Elias and Tiffel decide to set up new trusts with new beneficiaries. So their new families or their older families, they can always stand to benefit because they can always be beneficiaries of different trusts to make sure that your family is always well taken care of. Someone might be a great partner to you, but might not be the great step parent. And you can always make sure that your children who are now in a different household with a different step parents are always well taken care of. So it is always about not only planning professionally, but also planning in your personal capacity because all of these decisions tend to overlap. And it's always best to make these decisions early on so that you can protect yourself, protect your finances, protect your family going forward. And just to wrap up, like I said, as an estate agent, it is always best to have knowledge that you can impart on your clients that will set you apart from any other agent. Just to know the importance of structuring, just to know where you stand to benefit, for example, like I mentioned, with financing optimization, because if you help them plan properly, they will be able to access the funds, they will be able to continue their journey with property, and you will always have a client and you always have commission coming in. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Lisa. Yeah, again, the tax conversation, structuring conversations, actually so insightful and so relevant in the property space. And Lisa did mention this, but I don't know if everyone picked it up. So the thing with property is because of its value, like its intrinsic value right from the outset, it's considered a very big investment. So in a lot of spaces, only sophisticated people get into investments that size when it comes to like cash investments. But because of bank financing, almost anyone can get into property, if they simply can afford the repayments with the banks. So the same level of attention and consideration to that value isn't applied in the same way as if you'd pay R1 million for shares in a company. There you do due diligence, you'd make sure that the company is running well, that the finances and the books are in order. With property, you kind of take it for granted because it almost feels like it's not your money. It's not money from your pocket, it's the bank's money. So it doesn't feel that pressing. And what we're trying to get out is, for property investors, it is that pressing. You need to think ahead, you need to plan ahead. And your structuring is so key because your structuring dictates how much tax you're going to pay, how your property is going to be dealt with if you divorce, or if somebody dies, or if you die. And you can fix this later, but you're not giving it the same attention as a sophisticated investor would by paying R1 million in cash, because a sophisticated investor that's paying R1 million in cash to get involved in a business would think about this before paying that R1 million. You're buying an asset of the same value, but you're not giving it the same amount of attention, which means that they've obviously got a far greater advantage, because when they pass away, their business can continue. Your business as a property investor can't continue because now you've hampered it by involving yourself and your personal name somewhere in the in the mix of things. So yeah, Lisa, that was really, really cool. Thanks so much for that. So guys, that actually brings the content to an end. We ran about 10 minutes over, 14 minutes over, in fact, into our Q&A. If I'm actually, no, you know what? No, we might have actually planned that perfectly. We ran 4 minutes over. That's great. Before we do the Q&A, I just want to implore you guys, please, if you guys got value out of this, let us know. Approach us. Let's work together. Or if you guys don't mind, scan the QR codes, go on to Google, and yeah, just give some insights and feedback. We greatly appreciate this because we do quite a lot of this. So it's really nice to get that feedback in a forum where other people can actually share those insights and appreciate it and understand and get value. If everyone got value from it and puts a review down, obviously the next people we do this for would carry the same sentiments. But yeah, so for now it's Q&A. So I'm very happy to answer a couple of questions till about 12 o'clock. Yeah, so Nicoline, I see that you're on.
All right, guys, is there any questions? If anybody has a question, please put it in the chat box for us. So please say no if you don't have any questions, and if you do, just say yes, so we know we still wait for you guys. So anything in regards to what they said today, in structuring tax, there was so much information. I found it very, very valuable. So we got comments like, thank you very much, enjoyed the session, no questions at this time. Any questions, guys? Thank you so much. No questions. No question from our side. Thank you to all involved. No, thank you. It looks like you guys covered pretty much everything.
Wow. So the last time we went over, this time we actually managed to cover everything.
It looks like it. Everybody's just saying thank you very much. They really enjoyed it. Dion says extremely important. Thank you. No questions for now. Awesome. So guys, thank you so much. Bruno, Lisa, Nico, you guys were absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. We really, really enjoyed it. I just love learning from you guys. It's just like mind-blowing to see how many things there are that we've never thought of, or that we think of every day, but we haven't thought of it in that specific way. So thank you very much, guys. Thank you for all of you for joining us today. Thank you for all the officers that are sitting together. We really appreciate your time. And please scan the codes. For those of you who don't know how it works, just simply open your phone, your phone's camera, and then just hold it over the QR code, and then it will pop up. It'll go to a link. If you have an iPhone, there'll be like a little yellow block, and you just click on it and it'll take you to the website. Awesome. So please go and leave them a review. You guys, you were absolutely awesome. It's like the law guy, the tax lady, and the numbers guy. It was absolutely fantastic. We really enjoyed you guys. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Nicoline. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.